Mr. Speaker, I'm forced today to use a stopwatch. I've been given 20 minutes to comment on 57 different laws that to be amended today or this week. That gives me 21 seconds, Mr. Speaker, per law to be amended. And these laws, many of them, change our daily lives, our ability of our economy to recover our public finances, workers' rights, and so on and so forth. I can only deplore the state of affairs. Mr. Speaker, I've heard the many self-congratulatory speeches made here and there and everywhere by government ministers. But the truth is, and the facts are, that most other islands have fared better, sometimes much better than Mauritius. And some of them have bigger populations than us. Let's take Réunion next door, 0 deaths. Seychelles up north, 0 deaths. Puerto Rico, 2.9 million population, 0 deaths. Trinidad, 1.3 million population, 8 deaths. Timor-Leste, 1.3 million population, no deaths. Fiji, no deaths. So, Mr. Speaker, this means that islands have a specific advantage when dealing with coronavirus. That is, we can isolate our land, we can isolate our territory. Whatever decision the government may have taken after, some of them right decisions, we can only deplore the fact of its dragging its feet at the start of the epidemic and being unprepared, for instance, in the number of tests that were done in the first few weeks. Failure to stop flights from China in time, Mr. Speaker. Failure to close our borders in time. I intervened on the 12th of March. Minister Oriram found fit to insult me on radio. I intervened on the 12th of March to ask for the borders to be closed. The leader of the opposition also did so. It was only a week later that the borders were closed. And the failure, Mr. Speaker, to put all international passengers as they were arriving during that period in quarantine led to the disastrous first few weeks and led also to the fact that the population have had to suffer so much and the economy so much. I'm not saying everything was bad, but the truth remains the truth, that we dragged our feet. Maybe government was listening to WHO. He has disappeared, the doctor. Was listening to WHO, whatever they were doing. But we were not prepared, like many other countries, but this country was not prepared. When the first case came up in mid-March, we were not prepared. These are the facts. Mr. Speaker, I will now come to the quarantine bill. I will cut to the chase. I have not a lot of time. What I will deplore here is the fact there are no formal parliamentary control over the process of putting the country into a quarantine period. There are no formal parliamentary controls. We are told it's going to be done by government notice. Now, we know that government notice, you can obviously put a motion to annul the government notice, but Parliament needs to be sitting. If Parliament is not sitting because you have sent it sine die into recess, or it is not meant to be sitting, then we cannot table a motion of disallowance against a government notice. And when it is sitting, when it sits next, it's up to 30 days for the government to take it, and often experiments are shown that they take it at 3 a.m. in the morning, just to discourage people from listening. Mr. Speaker, this quarantine period needs formal approval, in my view. Not immediately. Okay, let's have 2 weeks. It's up to the minister to put us in quarantine for 2 weeks. But after 2 weeks, Parliament should be sitting and should review that decision, whether it is right or it is wrong and when it should be held. Mr. Speaker, this Parliament is not appropriate to sit during a pandemic. The Minister of Health himself admitted it just now. He said, to my astonishment, that if we had many cases of coronavirus, we would not be sitting today. Look back at the Hansard and you will hear you see what he said. He just admitted it. This Parliament doesn't have the distancing that is required, the 2-meter distancing, to allow us to sit. The quarantine bill The first thing it should have done is to make sure that we can sit, as the provisions are made, that this Parliament can sit in a hybrid mode and that members of Parliament can intervene like every other Parliament in the world through social media, through Zoom or whatever. This is a major flaw in the law, parliamentary control, and the fact that the quarantine period, no mention is made of how Parliament is sitting, and the Minister of Health himself has admitted that we will not be able to sit if there was really a pandemic outside. So that is, Mr. Speaker, what I'm saying. Now we are doing a lot, we are actually suspending civil liberties during a pandemic. Police have so many powers. A quarantine officer can put me in quarantine for as long as he wishes. And this is all being done without formal parliamentary control. I say this is wrong, Mr. Speaker. Now, this quarantine officer, it's a new post. He has the power to incarcerate people or not to incarcerate them. It's not qualified. It's up to him. He doesn't know me. He doesn't like me. He puts me in a quarantine. He likes me. I am related to someone. I have some political power. I don't know what I have. He says, okay, you go for self-isolation. Even here, we have a pays get figure. Even here, it is up to the quarantine officer to decide what to do with the person. And we know how it's going to work. We know that Gros Palto, they'll go home. Chijimun will go and sit in Suyak or wherever they're sitting, sometimes sleeping outside. That's what happened at the beginning when I said the government was not prepared. The quarantine facilities were awful, Mr. Speaker. Anyway, so this is my issue. I will not dwell so much about it. I'm just saying that I do not agree that we remove judicial supervision of our police force, especially insofar as the police are allowed to enter people's premises. With, apparently, this new quarantine officer who is going to be like a god during quarantine period. This cannot be. The law, the judicial supervision of the police must remain, especially when we have seen films recently. Are we all living in the same country? Have we seen films of the police torturing people, filming their own torture of people in this country and putting it on social media? I must have seen it, Mr. Speaker. You must have seen this young girl who was arrested because she put a joke on Facebook. Not only was she arrested, she was hidden from her lawyers for 3 or 4 hours in the SSU premises and then kept overnight. And it is the next day that she was interrogated by the police. So this is, Mr. Speaker, I do not trust this police. And therefore I cannot agree to giving this particular police more powers than they already have. Mr. Speaker, I will move now to the COVID bill. Firstly, the Bank of Mauritius bill. We will not agree to give a blank check, unrestricted access to billions upon billions of rupees. They've just taken 18 billion rupees from the Bank of Mauritius. We cannot accept that this government will have access to billions of freshly printed rupees for the purpose of just spending on anything they like, and also access to the $7 billion of foreign reserves belonging to the people of Mauritius, as the leader of the opposition quite rightly said. Mr. Speaker, the government, what is the track record of this government? Excessive investment in white elephant projects. The wonderful, I'm being ironic by the way, stadium that cost 5 billion rupees. Safe City, now we're all wearing masks. I don't know if the Safe City project cameras can even pick us up. It cost 18 billion rupees and needed roads in the north and the south of the island, and so on and so forth. Whilst the sugar sector, the textile sector, the tourism sector have continued to decline and to cap it all, Mr. Speaker. In 2019, we've had the worst GDP growth rate since the last 15 years at 3%. These are facts, and this is before even a whiff of COVID-19. So this is the government that we have. And today we have the offshore sector seriously threatened. Bankruptcy of Air Mauritius, SBM 7 billion rupees of debt, of bad debts. And Mr. Speaker, I want to say something about what is called fiscal dominance. This is fiscal dominance is dominance of government over the central bank, over the monetary authority. Fiscal authority having dominance over the monetary authority. We have a novice governor of the Bank of Mauritius. We have a new board of directors. These, Mr. Speaker, these people are answerable to nobody. We are one of the few democracies where the central bank of our country, which manages hundreds of billions of our rupees, is not accountable to this Parliament in any way at all. Let me take, Mr. Speaker, what can I take to convince you that this is not right? Let me take the Federal Reserve Bank of the US. Do you know that it is accountable to Congress, the US Congress? The European Central Bank is accountable to the European Parliament. The Bank of England is accountable to the Treasury Committee of the House of Parliament. The Reserve Bank of Australia to its Parliament, and so on and so forth. These 9 people who are directors of the Bank of Mauritius, who are they accountable to? Ils sont peut-être redevables towards the minister or the prime minister who appointed them. But these billions of rupees, they have nothing. They are not accountable to anyone. They waste it. They make big mistakes. They lose our money. And they just say, goodbye, I'm going home. Appoint a new board, please. This is not acceptable, Mr. Speaker. It may be acceptable, all this quantitative easing, all this printing of money, all this foreign exchange investment in companies, all this use of special reserve fund. It might be in a different country, in a different set of circumstances, be acceptable. They cannot be acceptable when the people who are going to take the decisions, the board of the Bank of Mauritius, is not accountable to this Parliament, to any other democratic institution in this country. They are a law unto themselves, Mr. Speaker. So we have the danger, of course, the danger of unlimited amounts of money being printed because there are no controls, there's fiscal dominance. The government controls entirely the central bank. That will lead to inflation, for sure. That will lead also to devaluation of the rupee because you're printing more rupees, and also could lead to a serious hyperinflation in Mauritius. That is what can be done. And it must be done under the strictest of circumstances, and it must be done, Mr. Speaker, as I said, with the right democratic controls in place, and there are none in Mauritius. 18 billion rupees of our rupees were taken recently by the Minister of Finance after the elections. Who approved it, apart from the people at the Bank of Mauritius? Nobody. It is our money, Mr. Speaker, sir. Now, the Special Reserve Fund. That, Mr. Speaker, is an invitation to depreciate. You know what that is? We have 7 billion US dollars of foreign exchange. Now, the rupee depreciates by 10%. The Special Reserve Fund increases by $700 million, 30 billion rupees. That is the truth of it. It hasn't made any profits. It is just a paper transaction. 30 billion rupees comes into the Special Reserve Fund. The board of the Bank of Mauritius writes a check, gives it to the Minister of Finance, and he has 30 billion rupees for no effort at all. How he's done that? He's printed the money. That is a danger, again, of using the Special Reserve Fund. And these are being put in place without any limits whatsoever. So we run. We don't have to. If the government is prudent, if the government changes from what it's done over the last 5 years. But if it isn't, if it continues on the same path that it's done in the past, we will run into serious trouble as to hyperinflation. Now, of course, Mr. Speaker, inflation may suit the Minister of Finance. Why? The increases is given recently for the poor pensioners. That will disappear. That will be called back by inflation. the increases in the minimum wage, that will be clawed back by inflation. VAT would increase with inflation. And I mentioned huge gains in the special reserve fund, so with depreciation of the rupee. So we must be careful. Inflation can be, and I'm sure will be, a useful tool for the current Minister of Finance and for this government to take back all the electoral promises that it has not already taken back in this particular bill. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, sir, we say no to unrestricted access to our reserves held by the Bank of Mauritius, by an incompetent, weakened board, by a weakened board governed, Mr. Speaker, by a government who will impose upon it. And again, as the leader of the opposition said, we've been on the same list as Zimbabwe now, and we will soon, if we are not careful, end up again like Zimbabwe in terms of hyperinflation. Mr. Speaker, there are other things, I don't know if I have time, the changing of the definition of debt. Well, ask yourself, Mr. Speaker, why would a parastatal body keep hundreds of millions of rupees that it doesn't need and suddenly is going to be deducted from the national debt? Why? If it doesn't need it, if it hasn't got to pay its debts with that, if it hasn't got projects with that, but give it to the government by way of dividends. So if it is in a parastatal body, there's a reason for it, and it should not be deducted from the public debt, Mr. Speaker. And before I finish on this issue, what is the other side of the coin? We've been told to vote all this, give all these powers. The government hasn't come up with a word about what is going to happen, what is going to be used, how all this money, the hundreds of billions that it is taking, are going to be used to save people's lives, to stop massive unemployment, and to help the poor in this country, and to prevent companies from going under. That is, Mr. Speaker, in the limited amount of time, I'm going to say this. Mr. Speaker, I'm going to talk now about the debt ceiling. It has to be suspended, I agree, because every country is having recourse to debt, quite rightly. But it cannot be suspended forever. Neither can it just be suspended and no new figure given. That is irresponsible towards the nation. So I would invite the government, Mr. Speaker, to change that, to make it, to give it a sunset clause, this repeal, and to tell us what the government considers is an acceptable debt ceiling given the problems. What is it? Is 65% now? What do you want? 80%? 90%? Tell us what you have in mind, so that at least we know where we are going, Mr. Speaker, sir. Mr. Speaker, I want to come to clause 24 concerning the government wage assistance scheme. There is a problem with that. It is arbitrary in its application. I'm going to be technical for a few seconds only. It depends, Mr. Speaker, if you, in fact, the people who will have to repay the GWS, the wage assistance scheme, the companies, it will depend on their financial year ends. If your financial year end is in May or June, likelihood is you will have to repay it, even though you have 1 year more of very hard or very tough and very high losses. If your year end is December, likelihood is you will not pay because you have 8 or 9 months of the COVID and after COVID. So my appeal to the Minister of Finance on this issue is that the loss is that the 2 years should be taken, and an average of the 2 years should be taken. I can explain it in detail at any time, but it is the average of the 2 years that should be taken. Otherwise, you will end up with many companies having to repay the wage assistance scheme only because their year ends happens to be in May and June and not for any other reason, and that is surely unfair, Mr. Speaker, sir. As far as Clause 30 is concerned, now there's a lot of confusion in my mind. The Landlord and Tenants Act, giving 6 months moratorium. The Landlord and Tenants Act only applies to commercial properties let before 2005 and not at all to furnished residential properties. So when we're talking, the great majority 90% or 95% of rented commercial properties and rented household properties will not come at all under this moratorium that is being offered. It is only being offered to a tiny, tiny number of sitting tenants who were there sitting in their respective commercial properties before 2005. We should do that in the UK. What we should do is not provide even a moratorium, but insist that landlords by law cannot act aggressively against their tenants in that period of time. Aggressively, I mean in terms of winding up petition, in terms of eviction orders. And that should cover, Mr. Speaker, so with all due respect, all rented properties in Mauritius, and not only a tiny proportion, as the government is doing at the moment. Mr. Speaker, what surprises me most of all is the complete silence of the Minister of Health when the leader of the opposition, and myself I will, too, and other members of the opposition, talk about the Pharmacy Act. Now, the leader of the opposition, quite rightly, has made a scathing attack on clause 41 of the bill, saying that there has been there an exemption to sell medicine in Mauritius and that this change enables the pharmacy board to exempt anyone it pleases from registering its product. This puts the population at risk. Any Tom, Dick, and Harry that the pharmacy board decides can sell any medicine it wants because it is exempted. And this has nothing to do with COVID. And the Minister of Health speaks and doesn't say anything. And the Prime Minister himself introduces the bill and doesn't mention this exemption, whereas it could affect the whole of the nation. Why? Is it, as the minister, as the leader of the opposition has said, to do with probably a friend of government who has a project? This has to be answered. I would love the answer to be no. He has to explain. He had the patience to explain. He said not a word. He said not a word about it. He said not a word about it. He said not a word about it. And I understand, Mr. Speaker, the pharmacy board is being changed, and 4 pharmacists at the Ministry of Health who complained about this have been transferred. And this is a real danger for the population. I was waiting for the minister to say something, and he said nothing. What can I say? Sinon, c'est coupable. Mr. Speaker, now, on this question of the fines, I was one of the first to say that the fines should be increased. That 500 rupees from non-respect of curfew is far too little. But I never thought it would go up to 200,000 rupees. This is, as has been stated, an abuse. An abuse. Now the Prime Minister has said also that spitting is an offense. If you spit now, are you going to have a 200,000 rupee fine? 5 years imprisonment? Also, if you spit now? As any modern country, the fine should be defined. First offense, let's say 2,000 rupees. Second offense of breaking curfew, a bit more. Third offense, a bit more, and so on and so forth. And after that, imprisonment. Not as it's being done now. The heavy fine should be, Mr. Speaker, for the people, the entrepreneurs who put all these foreign workers in deadly, unhealthy conditions, who are going to force their workers to work now in unhealthy conditions. These are the heavy fines. The heavy fines should not come to an individual who has broken the curfew because he's gone to see his mother or something like that, who is walking in the street. There should be a fine probably, but not this. It's unacceptable. Mr. Speaker, I'll come to the public office. How am I doing? Huh? I'll look now at the Public Officers Protection Act. Very good. The public officers are protected. Even if you threaten them now, you pay 200,000 rupees and you go up to 5 years in prison, just threatening them. Okay, they need to be protected. I have the greatest respect for them. But let us not pretend that they are also abused by public officers, abused by police officers on the public. And a caring government doesn't see that side of things. And a caring government doesn't wish, after all the videos that have been produced, etc., doesn't wish to protect the population. The Independent Police Complaints Commission is shut at a time like this, with no provision in the COVID bill for it to sit, even digitally. This is the situation. Mr. Speaker, on the Workers' Rights Act, I'm happy that now, as an afterthought, those that are going to be laid off will be on the workfare program and receive money. But what is the justification for them to be laid off, to accept being laid off, accept months or more of technical unemployment, only to be told that I'm changing your salary as you come back? Before you come back, I'll tell you, sorry, my friend, you've waited a year or two, whatever it is, now you're going to get half your salary. This is going to potentially impoverish workers in Mauritius. And that is not right. You make the sacrifice, you accept to be laid off, but you come back with your same rights and conditions as and when you started. Mr. Speaker, I have just 3 bits to say. We're all proud of our frontliners. Every country is. We're very proud of our frontliners. I just don't mean the policemen and the nurses and the doctors, but also the little people who work in the supermarkets, etc., lives at risk. We have now decided that they will not, that local leaves will not be cut. Fantastic. That is not what is expected. What is expected is that they should be rewarded by this government. They should be rewarded by the COVID Solidarity Fund. They should be rewarded, and that is what is to be expected of a nation who cares about its people. 2 little things. Motor vehicle insurance. Motor vehicle insurers are making billions of rupees of profit during this pandemic because our cars are not running. Yet they had the cheek to publish a paper to say that they will not cover vehicles that have had an accident unless they have a paper from the police, etc. That is not right. Someone may be going to see his mother because she is sick, or whatever it is, has an accident. And then, Mr. Speaker, if you look at the definition by the Motor Vehicle Insurance Association, they will not cover that. They will cover only if you're going to an essential service. And your mother is not an essential service, obviously. And this is wrong, and I expected the COVID-19 bill to make provision so that motor insurance covers us. Because we are paying. Not a person in Mauritius has received a refund for the 2 months that we're not using our cars. That is not right. And lastly, Mr. Speaker, I have a thought for the parents who will be going to work, probably as from the 15th, many of them are working, many will be working. What happens to their children? I don't have a solution, but I have only a wish, Mr. Speaker, that we can find a solution. Of course, some will be working from work, but what about all the textile workers? What about all the construction workers? What about all the fishermen, all the plants? Can they work from home? Obviously they cannot. Obviously they cannot work from home. Only people like us, white-collar workers, can work from home. The others cannot work from home. They will have to attend the factories. Work from home is very nice for the Prime Minister to say work from home. If you work in a textile factory, how do you work from home? You cannot. So, Mr. Speaker, sir, I have a special thought as I finish to all the parents who are worried about what to do with their children. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, whatever I have said, and I believe that it is for the best of our country that we are frank and truthful about the state of affairs, and that we continue to hold this government to task. I only wish that when we sit next time, it is on a Tuesday, so that we can ask proper questions of this government. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.